Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, author Gaia Vince on climate migration.
Yeah, people don't want to leave, but they have no choice. And as the temperature goes up, as these extreme weather conditions happen, people are going to have to move. When we do surveys of people, of populations, generally the majority of people are actually kind, generous, non-xenophobic, not racist, they're not that prejudiced actually, and they're open and welcoming to strangers and to new people. I feel that we have an obligation and a responsibility to make sure that in the decades to come, these people are at least given, the opportunity and helped to live in the safe parts of the world.
Gaia Vince, welcome to Chatter.
Such a pleasure to be on with you, David.
And such a pleasure to finally speak with you. I've been a fan of your writing and speaking for quite some time. I didn't know where you'd go after your book Transcendence from several years ago, but you hit it out of the park, as we say, with the follow-on Nomad Century, which is a topic I really want to talk about, which is climate migration. So we'll get into a lot of details about that, some of the wonderful stories you researched by traveling primarily around the global South, but speaking with a number of people who work on this issue and, of course, your own insights on it. But I do want to go back a little bit earlier because you've described yourself in some public engagements as a writer and a former scientist. And that always struck me as both incredibly honest, because it implies you're admitting that you're not currently engaging in day-to-day science, but also sad because science to me is more of a mindset and a way of looking at the world. And can you ever really be a former scientist? So explain how you see your background in chemistry and engineering and how it mixes with and combines with your current interests and explorations of all of these issues around us as global citizens.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, being a scientist is a kind of mindset as well. And it's also because of my training and that perspective I have, it's with me in the way that I look at things. It's always a background to how I understand the world and how I see it and the kinds of questions I ask and try to answer. So, yeah, I mean, I did work as a scientist briefly. I trained as a scientist, and then I guess I wrote about science more, but carried out some of my own research in a different field through asking questions and through trying to find answers to things that are not lab-based. I mean, I have published papers or been a co-author on papers since. So I don't know. I feel that to call myself a scientist now might be disingenuous. I might be giving the impression that I'm producing groundbreaking research in a lab, which I'm not doing at all. And I have huge admiration for people who are doing that, of course. And I wouldn't want to steal any of their thunder in that respect. But I have a role as at the UCL Anthropocene Institute, and I lecture and talk about different aspects of my research and about science generally. So I guess I'm that bridge between doing science and talking about it.
There probably is a fun cultural anthropology study to be had on the evolution of certain terms and what they imply. Like philosopher used to be a much wider term, scientist, and how now, like you said, you don't want to be perceived as, practicing active science, so you don't use the term as much, whereas somebody who is curious about the world and asking questions about it, even if they weren't doing experiments a couple of 100 years ago, you were a philosopher or you were a scientist.
Yeah, absolutely. And these meanings do change. And I know that there are some journalists, for example, that have science backgrounds and who describe themselves. I'm thinking of one that describes himself as a geneticist now, in order to sort of basically boost his credentials, and that doesn't sit right with me. I don't know. I wouldn't call myself a chemist. I would say I was a chemist, or I have a chemistry background or something. But I
Maybe that's
wouldn't
it.
say,
Maybe it's
yeah. But I
specialist
wouldn't say that
appropriation.
I'm a working chemist
Yes.
now. Whereas he, for example, and several people do this, call themselves by labels that I feel are slightly stretching. But it's a personal decision, of course it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you bring to this such an interesting take, both from the scientific perspective, but from a very holistic point of view. And you've spoken before about being the daughter and granddaughter of refugees and migrants. Can you tell a bit of that story and how it becomes yours?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're all migrants.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us, even if we're not first generation or second generation, I've lived in several different countries. So I've had that experience myself of being a migrant. I'm a citizen of two countries, of Britain and also Australia. My mother is British. My father is Australian, but he's also British, and he was born in Hungary. So and left during the revolution as a refugee, as with his parents, my grandparents. So I think, you know, there are multiple languages, there are multiple identities, and there is this kind of movement, there certainly has been in a lot of places in the last kind of decades, to try and say that you're not a true patriot and you're not a true citizen unless you reduce your identity down to this one citizenship or this one type of identity. And that goes against all of our human history. It goes against our cultural sensibilities and what it really means to have it. We all share multiple identities. We are multiples, as Walt Whitman said. For example, I can be British, I can be European, I can be, I can be a Londoner, I can be all of these things, and it doesn't detract from any of them. It doesn't make me less of one thing to be more. It only adds. It adds to the complexity that we all hold within ourselves.
That's fascinating observation, because so much of the current attempt to move, in a sense, beyond national identity, it goes bigger, it goes global, right? I am a citizen of the world. I am not a citizen only of this temporal oddity called a nation state. But yet, when you go back in time, you realize people didn't seem to think of themselves as global citizens. Often it was the hyper local, and I researched this with my own family when some people came over from Europe to the United States. Sometimes they didn't really know or care what country they were from. It was the village, it was the town, and they could say that. And then it ended up being the person who was accepting them into the country, often in the United States at Ellis Island, who would say, "Where is that?" And they would guess. And that reveals so much about how we place ourselves in this world, that right now it's a construct of, the post-Westphalian order, blah, 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 nation states. But how we define ourselves need not be restricted to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what it shows really is that these ideas of nations are exactly that. They are ideas. They're inventions. They in order to make them more real, they had to be. They had to have this whole propaganda machine around them to try and convince people that there is such a thing as a nation state and you're part of this nation. Because people never did feel like that. They didn't feel, the boundary were the people that they knew and perhaps the administrative district that they paid their taxes to, or that sorted out some of their laws. But it didn't go much beyond that. And quite often villages would transit through different nationhoods or different, ownership or according to the ruler, the king, or the religious ruler that happened to own that as these places were bought and sold. And their actual lives were, it kind of didn't really affect them, because they either had very little power, or all the power they had was still held within that village, within that small area. And so this idea that borders define where you are and where you live and who you are is really very novel, and that seems it's kind of an antithesis to everything that we have been told to accept as sort of set in stone about identity and about who belongs where and why.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually very new, and people, a few hundred years ago, they just wouldn't have understood that. Or
Right.
even more recently, it wouldn't really have made sense to them. The immigrants to the United States, they wouldn't have understood
Mm-hmm.
this kind of strange idea of borders before that.
No, the only strict parallel before that, of course, there were borders. Empires had outposts and things like that, but it seems like in terms of personal identity, it was religion, right? It was, I am part of this faith community, and yes, there are geographical aspects to it, but that's also in a belief system. You identify with a belief, not with where your feet happen to be at a particular time. And that's a different construct.
Yeah, and
Obviously, it overlays. Mm-hmm.
also to do with cultural things like where the language that your mother
Mm-hmm.
tongue came from, or the types of foods or the types of feast days that
Yeah.
you observed, all of those sorts of things, and they weren't necessarily held within a geographical border, but it was there was also a lot more overlap between different places. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the border posts that you're talking about, I mean, most of that was to do with keeping people in rather than keeping people out. There are lots of sort of parties that would go out and capture people because there weren't enough farm laborers, or there weren't enough people working in the military to support whatever king or fiefdom there was. So yeah, it was very much about trying to get more people in,
Mm-hmm.
and not about keeping them out.
Let's explore that a bit, because I remember my studies are in political science, international relations. Like you, I don't want to call myself a practicing political scientist, first of all, because I don't think political science is a real science. And secondly, because I'm not doing active research and publication in it. But I do recall that in recent history, within the past few centuries, the balance of power between nations was often a calculation of population, because population was the resource that could lead to everything from agriculture to manpower for warfare. And you had countries doing everything they possibly could to get more people on the margins. And what a difference to the rhetoric we hear today about
And
keeping
to
people
stop
out.
people leaving. Yeah, to stop people leaving
Yeah.
as well. It was a lot to do with that. They wanted to stop people leaving and get more people in, because it was very well recognized that the economy, whatever economy that was
Mm-hmm.
closely tied to the labor force and to how many people there were.
Right.
And that's something that, especially in our declining demography, we're not having enough babies to support the aging population anywhere, really. That sort of message has been lost a lot in this kind of populist rhetoric.
Absolutely. And what's driving the conversation now, and what you've explored, is the nexus between these dynamics and climate change. And I think we should be honest that over the long course of human and human adjacent history, there have been many migrations caused by climate changes. That's true. We're talking about a different kind of climate change here, a human induced climate change pattern that is going to spur within our lifetimes and within our children's lifetimes truly epic scale of migration that my fear is that we are not prepared for. And that may be part of the impetus for your research and writing as well. It bothers me here in America when I see news report after news report about the crisis at the southern border, when there are hundreds or perhaps thousands of people trying to come across the border, being driven by, yes, climate, but a number of things adjacent to climate in terms of socioeconomic, military, security issues, and the panic over thousands of people. And I keep shaking my head and thinking, in the next few decades, we're not talking thousands or tens of thousands. We're talking millions and tens of millions and eventually hundreds of millions. And if we don't start to change the way we think about that, the human suffering will be immense. And more importantly, we will not be able to take advantage of all the rich benefits that come from this opportunity of migration. And you have been writing right at the center of this. So I do want to jump into this and talk about the shift really from climate mitigation to adaptation that underlies this. A couple of decades ago, people were focused, to the extent they were, on climate, talking about avoiding the implications of climate change. It feels like we move past that now in most communities to realize that in places like Maldives, notably, and others, there will be no mitigation strategy that works 100 years from now. We must talk about adaptation, and that includes migration patterns. So give me some of your reflections on this, the shift that's happened as people have realized that we are not going to be able to, quote, avoid the implications of climate change because we can stop it, that we simply must start to think about the bigger patterns that will result from the certain effects that are already locked in.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say that I don't think this big realization has happened at all. And I don't hear enough about it. I hear a lot of keep 1.5 alive and all of this, which is, it's a nice sentiment, and wouldn't it be great? But we've already had our first year above 1.5, above the pre-industrial average.
Yeah.
That was an El Nino year. It was unusual, and we can't make long-term decisions based on 1 year. But the trend is absolutely certainly upwards. Even if we dip slightly for a year or two, we will continue to go up, and we're exceeding 1.5 degrees. And not only that, it looks as though the climate models have underestimated the sensitivity of temperature to carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, because, we're already experiencing extreme conditions that were not expected until the 2040s or even the 2050s. I'm talking particularly about Antarctic ice melt, about Arctic temperatures, about, temperatures, sea surface temperatures, and things like the ocean currents that drive the Gulf Stream. We're seeing perturbations there, which are extremely worrying. We're approaching at least 4 Earth system tipping points, beyond which, things get very, very worrying. So in terms of, the way the climate crisis is framed, it is still mostly on mitigation, and mitigation is absolutely vital because, we need to stop making this worse. But it's quite clear that we're now in the post-climate change world. The world's climate has already changed. We're already experiencing, extreme temperatures in the tropics. I mean, as I talk to you now, Bangladesh is in the, it's so hot there, the heat wave, that there will be large numbers of deaths. But it's also, it's in the 40s for quite a long period now. And that has all sorts of other knock-on effects for things like drought, to agricultural changes. And it's a big problem, to say the least. Farmers are already having to work at night with head torches because it's just dangerous to work during the day. And it's extremely expensive. It's expensive in terms of lives and health, like more than 60,000 deaths in Europe last year due to heat alone. The US is suffering, billions of dollars of climate disaster losses, and lives lost as well. This is the world's richest nation, and we've seen absolutely devastated residential areas, coastlines, and this is quite regular now. It's huge forest fires. Canada was on fire for most of last year. It's quite clear that we have left behind that reliable Holocene climate now. We have moved into a different time, and that that means that we have to adapt. We have to use those very, very strong human capabilities of adaptation, which we, have developed over 200,000 to 300,000 years, where we take an otherwise hostile environment and we adapt it to make it more livable for us, for our species, and we adapt ourselves to our environment. And at the moment, we're not even adapting the wealthy places, which are so at risk, let alone those very, very vulnerable areas in the global south. So we're heading into complete catastrophe. And when I talk about adaptation, I mean everything from the enormous transition of our energy systems, which is the most kind of visible area where we are making some progress, decarbonizing our electricity systems to start with, to changing completely our food production systems, changing our construction, our cities, everything, to the social transition of where we're going to live and how we're going to live in this new, much more extreme world that we're creating.
Yeah, we'll explore a few of those in depth as we go on here. There's one thing that I want to get out of the way first, which is what I call the tech bro solution. So people will look at Dubai and they'll say, well, we can handle climate change because look at Dubai. It is not just surviving, but it is thriving in this era because we have technology our ancestors didn't to make unlivable places livable. And let's be honest, Dubai has been barely habitable for a long time, but now people are flocking there. So the idea is the Dubai model leads to a solution for the world. Can you please debunk this for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Dubai is completely unlivable, as is Qatar, as is Saudi Arabia. These very hot desert states, which historically have been home to very small populations of nomadic people who live in very adapted ways to the environment and came up with all sorts of really ingenious cultures to manage this very hostile environment and in many cases thrive across it. What we have now is these very adapted technological solutions. Yes, so people are living. Small numbers of very wealthy people are living in very, very adapted sort of air-conditioned shopping malls. I mean, that's kind of the model there, and everything they need is brought into them. You know, all their water, their energy, their food, literally everything is nothing comes from Dubai. It's all brought into them. And anyone who, lives or works outside of that model, say the construction workers, as we saw during the Qatar sports,
the World Cup, right?
World Cup, yeah. They die because the conditions are unlivable there. And many of them, of course, are climate migrants that have sought work there. They're either from Nepal or Bangladesh, and they've gone there, or Pakistan, they've gone there as climate migrants because where they come from, they cannot earn a living and they cannot work anymore. And they die because this extreme heat has, it literally cooks your body. I mean, we're made of animal cells, and it starts to denature the proteins of our cell membranes. We get these, we get the fats of our actual body start to come apart. We're literally cooking, and it's a horrible way to die, of kidney failure, of heart attacks, or, just heat exhaustion. So yes, that is a solution for small numbers of very wealthy people, but it is not a solution for tens of millions of people. The population of, say, Mumbai, which is, depending on how you calculate it, it's around 50 million people living there. And 9 million of those are living in slum housing, which are these kind of concrete boxes with corrugated iron. They're these sort of one-room shacks, very poor sanitation. And the temperature in them are already 6 to 10 degrees above the temperature in the sort of city proper. They're also on the edge of the ocean. So every time there's a storm surge or flash flooding occurs, or the salt water actually comes up from the ground because the water table is impacted. The sanitation is terrible. They get outbreaks of all sorts of diseases. There is no way that, Mumbai in 2050 or 2060 will be home to this 50 million population. It's just not, it will be unlivable. Mumbai will still exist. They can, they can adapt for a smaller population. But I mean, at the moment, the population is still increasing as with climate migrants from rural areas that are dealing with drought and other problems. So these people are going to have to move, and the idea that we can adapt to some of the, adapt large populations to the mighty power of the oceans, or storm surges, or hurricanes and typhoon. We're dreaming.
Right.
We're dreaming.
Well, rationally, and I do want to talk later about the limits of rationality, but rationally, there is a solution here when you look at humanity as a global species, which is within the next 50 to 75 years, you have several major countries in the global north that could be approaching half of their current population due to demographic decline, and you will have an aging population that requires the services of a huge amount of workers that simply aren't there. And at the same time, you have a lot of people, primarily but not exclusively in the global south, who literally will need to move somewhere. And many of them, even now, will say to you when you speak with them, well, I really just want to work somewhere. I want to be productive. I want to do something. Well, it doesn't take a genius to put those two together and say, this is like a jigsaw puzzle piece that is quite obvious to sight. Now, there are many obstacles along the way, but you've pointed out that by ditching the geopolitical mindset and looking at this as a global problem, which it is, we have a global solution, and it involves migration of those who need to move to places where they need migrants, right?
Well, the last time this happened really was in plague times. So in the medieval plague times, right, around a third to a half of Europe's population died. And that was a huge shock, and it had enormous political implications across the entire sort of Eurasian region. And that's what we stand to lose just through demographic change. And at the same time, older people are living longer, and their needs are growing much more complex. We have dementia, we have multiple morbidities, and they need care work. And this is not something that AI can, sort out, as the Japanese have discovered through many years of trying to avoid the idea that you might need human immigrants to do this job. The Japanese outsell their adult nappies or diapers, outsell infant ones already. Korea, exactly the same thing. So this is a really obvious thing, which is actually a huge economic crisis that we're on the verge of. Some countries are facing it faster than others. Some of the most xenophobic countries, rather hilariously, are facing this. And it's kind of obvious why, because other countries have, been solving the problem, inch by inch by increasing immigration. But places like, for example, Russia is one of the fastest depopulating nations on earth. Italy, similar issues. The whole of Sicily, is emptying out incredibly rapidly. And this is a real problem. And it's not just the global north. It's not just rich countries. It's happening everywhere on Earth. But there are some places where population is either stable or still increasing. And demographers expect global population to peak quite soon, actually. Well, in the 2060s, certainly by the 2060s, if not before, and then start to decline. So we're often told, human population is going to go up, and population is the big thing no one's talking about. Well, actually, it's only increasing in a very few places, but it does so happen that these very few places it increases, coincidentally, are the very few places that are becoming much, much more dangerous. And they are places in Africa, particularly, as well as a few places in Asia. Most of Asia is actually also decreasing, or at least stable by now. And so it does seem like an absolute no-brainer to help people move from those dangerous areas to places where there are enormous labour shortages. It seems so incredibly obvious. but sometimes the most obvious ideas are not politically convenient
Right.
to the leadership in place at the time. And this has now become quite a stuck narrative that was, it was originally a right-wing populist narrative, but there has been so much timidity from centrist and left-wing and right-wing centrist parties to actually come up with a much more pragmatic alternative narrative that really everybody is sort of cowering behind this fear of talking positively about immigration. In most of Europe, in the United States, and in some other places, and that is economically absolutely foolish, because this completely solves the problem, but also it's very socially divisive, because we do live in nations and in cities which are where our co-workers and our colleagues and our neighbors and our friends are either first or second generation immigrants. And so to have this dominant narrative that is so anti-immigration is a poison, and it's kind of polluting discourse generally about what should be a very straightforward, practical solution. We shouldn't be debating whether it's right or wrong. This is happening anyway. We should be debating rather the different ways of managing it to make it work, because we have lots of choices and there isn't necessarily one right way, but we certainly do need to manage this for our benefit, and also, of course, the benefit of the migrants and of the countries of origin that these migrants come from, because we have this huge climate crisis.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's especially frustrating because there are a couple of additional factors that make it even more compelling. One is that the transportation revolution of the past couple of centuries has made it all the more easier for mass movements of people. It would have been hard 1,000 years ago for millions of people or even thousands of people to easily move from, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa to Japan or to Alaska. Whereas now it is not without cost, but it is trivially easy. Secondly, it's ahistorical to have this point of view of migration bad, because migration has been the story of humanity. Humans are, you had a great phrase that I've forgotten from the audiobook I listened to, but something about, we're the primates who have moved. We're the primates who figured out that we could actually change our location. And you had a great phrase for it. We're the only species that don't just adapt by, settling and then branching into new species, but we actually migrate ourselves and stuff to us to make other places habitable. Our whole history shows we do this, and we don't have this lockdown bunker mentality. So it's especially frustrating that people forget both the history and forget the technology that we've developed that allows us to come up with solutions to this.
And it's not just, this is not just a sort of characteristic that's kind of interesting to observe. It's the very foundations of our success. If we had stayed in East Africa or even just the African continent, just the tropics of Africa, like chimpanzees who have really not changed their behavior or habitat in 5 million years, or actually look at any of the other apes. They all live in sort of very similar tropical niches. If we had not changed that, we would not be this successful species. It is partly through our dispersals, which have provoked us to have to adapt in various ways, and this great mixing of humanity, the bringing together of different ideas and genes and technologies and cultures and languages and behaviors and all of that has enabled this great fusion, this acceleration in our culture in all different aspects of it, that has produced this incredible species that we are, this globalized species. And so, to sort of say it's unnatural or bad to migrate at this stage in our evolution is very bizarre, really.
Totally. Think about the art and culture of any other species. By definition, we can't. The very act of migration has led to evolution and advancement. One argument that you probably hear more than any other, at least as an initial argument against what I would say is mass migration of workers as part of this, is that migrant workers steal local jobs and lower the wages for everyone, but particularly of people who are in whatever working class is defined as such. Talk through that and explain what the research actually shows.
Yeah, so there are several tropes that populists particularly, but also people who fear migration fall back on, and you know, some of them seem sensible. That, you know, there are only a certain number of jobs, so if people come in from outside, they're going to steal those jobs, and local people won't have any, and they'll also push down the wages, and and maybe they'll increase the crime. All of these things, all of these very scary tropes are bandied around, and people will start to believe them. But actually, you know, all the evidence shows, and this is wide-ranging data from gathered from you know, small to large-scale, really large-scale migrations across the US, across different European cities and states, show the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. That actually immigration increases the economic productivity, and that actually raises wages generally, especially and particularly for local citizens, for the original inhabitants. It raises them faster and further. It also decreases unemployment. The crime rate actually generally goes down, and the crime rate among immigrants is particularly low, largely because they're sort of afraid, I suppose, of any reason that they might be targeted for removal or sent back. So they are particularly well-behaved citizens generally. But that does sound a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? Why would it go up? Why would wages go up? And the reason is because the economy is not this zero-sum game. There aren't X number of jobs, and if more people come in, then there are, you know, X minus the number of people come in jobs. That is not how economies work at all. The economy expands as more people come in, and the density of people coming in actually expands it even further, because you get this synergy where the productivity is greater than the sum of its parts, and that's particularly exciting, and the reason why cities are so much more productive, for example, than small towns. It's that density of people, and as people come in, of course, it requires more jobs. It requires more. You know, there are more hairdressers because more people need their hair cut. There are more people need to buy things. They need to have their gardens done. But also, if you need your garden done, the person that's going to have that job doesn't necessarily need to have, you know, first language skills. Mm-hmm. So it's likely that it will be an immigrant doing these generally more low paid jobs. Which means that people that were doing them before then get the better paid jobs, which is why their wages often go up. They are better local citizens, existing populations are better networked, they have better language skills, they better understand the systems of their own country. So they are much more likely to profit from this enlarged economy that comes, the increase in industry and jobs. So they tend to do better. They tend to be the bosses of the incomers. So that's with the most feared incoming population, which are the low skilled wages. And when we talk about low skills, what we're talking about is generally not professional jobs, what are classed as professional jobs. I would say cutting hair, for example, is an enormous skill, because I certainly can't do it. And the same with gardening, the same with childcare. These are classed as low skilled jobs, same as care work. All right. And they're absolutely essential to the running of the economy, to to the running of all of our lives, right? We cannot, our cities don't work as we've seen, particularly at the moment, I would say in post-Brexit Britain, where a lot of these people have left. We are struggling now.
Right.
There are shortages across the market, particularly in these low-skilled jobs. And without that workforce, without that labour force, basically oiling the wheels of the more kind of sophisticated or professional economy and labour market, everything grinds to a halt and everything is harder and more expensive. So that low skilled wage group is really, really essential, which makes it bizarre how a lot of our border policies are aimed at only attracting high-skilled immigrants and high-skilled labour, which it kind of gives the impression that, do you not think your current citizens are capable of being brain surgeons or whatever, bankers and so on. And of course, we need those as well. We need it across all levels of society. We cannot have this bizarre kind of hierarchy because it serves nobody. And in Britain, for example, even to be a student, if you want to bring your partner or over, they have to earn a certain amount, which is completely crazy, because it limits again all levels of productivity. So I think it's really important, and there has been an abdication of responsibility for sure among leadership that are not extreme. You know, I certainly expect populist leaders to target and demonize immigrants and come up with a lot of these false narratives about them. You know, that's their shtick. That's completely what you expect. Yeah. But for other leaders to kind of timidly not touch the subject or not challenge it is actually a complete abdication of their, you know, responsibility as members of society. And you know, they're clearly not showing any leadership at all, because they should be challenging this and they should be coming out with a much more pragmatic and a much more positive narrative around immigration, which after all has built, well, particularly the United States so recently.
Right. Yeah, there are two thoughts there that occur to me. One is the very shallow thinking that goes into, well, we, however we define we do not want those low skill workers coming, as they're defined, low skill, coming over to our country for reasons X, Y, and Z. But we definitely want people who are of a certain professional class. Maybe they are software engineers, maybe they're surgeons, maybe they're accountants, whatever it is. And that's very shallow thinking, of course, on one level you've discussed, but another level is, well, if you bring in 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 people that you have just defined that way, who's going to support them in society, right? Who's going to be growing the food? Who's going to be doing all of those other things that you have just said you don't want? So there's that shallowness of thinking, but there's also the lack of intellectual curiosity to actually figure out what are the benefits of this, because there's plenty of research to show this. And I like the case study that you've cited and I've seen explored in depth elsewhere, which is the Philippine nurses. The fact that the Philippines has become, in a sense, a hub of global healthcare through its nursing training and practice and, if you will, export of workers. But importantly, that it helps not only individual economies where you have the migration, but it helps the Philippine economy too, because of the continuing connections. So even countries that might say, well, we don't want all of our workers, and I happen to think nursing is a highly skilled job category and should not be categorized in the way it often is. But even people who say, well, we shouldn't allow that because we have our own needs as our demographics change. Well, it benefits both societies, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is where policy needs to be smart. And this is why we need to move on past the, you know, immigrants bad, immigrants good kind of ridiculousness, and just say, you know, immigration is part of life. It is increasing. It will increase further. How do we manage it with smart policy? So in the case of the Philippines, you know, in the West, in places like the US, where the elderly population is increasing with complex needs. There is a massive shortage in the number of, aged care, geriatric nursing, geriatric care work, people who need to lift people, change elderly people, respond to, hearing loss, dementia care, all of these tasks, which is there is this huge growing market for, and an absolute lack of care, and this is a bomb coming to hit, my generation, certainly my parents' generation, very soon, as they get older. Who is going to be the person looking after them? Because we don't have enough people in our own countries. It's going to be immigrants. But then if you look at some of these poorer countries who are exporting some of these nurses, like the Philippines, they don't have the same need in elderly care, but they do have needs in, pediatric care, in infant care, in cancer care, in some of the areas in infectious disease control, those sorts of things, where as a poorer country, they need healthcare workers as well. So a smart policy is for rich countries to pay poor countries to, set up training facilities, set up colleges and institutes where nurses can be trained in different specialities, and to guarantee to take some of the geriatric care nurses, as immigrants to their country, at the same time as helping pay for the needs of the local population in pediatric care or obs and gynae or something, so that there is benefit to both parts of this equation, and it's not just an extractive or exploitative situation. I mean, at the moment, migration is handled so badly that Filipino care workers and nurses are, come to countries like the US or Britain, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. They're paid very poor wages. They're constantly in fear of being deported. And meanwhile, they are spending most of their wages, sending them back to their families. They don't see their children quite often, who are cared for by their parents, while they're nursing. And there is this brain drain, or this labor force drain of expertise that is leaving, and then they eventually are sort of kicked out. They're not allowed to bring their families. They're sort of kicked out of these countries after donating or giving enormous amounts to society, both in their labor and in tax, and in all the other ways that a citizen pays that local economy and takes part in it, and leaves. And we lose that expertise. We lose those members of society. The Philippines has lost these people during their working age, and then has to support them in old age. And there's really no winners to that. It could be done a lot better and a lot fairer. And we have to remember during all of these conversations that, we live in a very unequal world, which, for historic reasons is unequal due to, the nature of everything from, the slave trade to colonization, empire building, and all of that. And more recently to the way that, banks and markets have ensured that a lot of these countries are kept impoverished, to the fact that there is an unequal distribution because of the development of the north versus the south of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we're causing the problems in the Philippines is already dealing with terrible flash floods, horrendous typhoons, awful droughts as well, unendurable heat. They are right at the forefront of the climate crisis, which historically has not been caused by these countries at all. And, I feel that we have an obligation and a responsibility to make sure that in the decades to come, these people are at least given, the opportunity and helped to live in the safe parts of the world.
There seems to be a tension here when it comes to that. Like, how do we make that happen? On the one hand, you've mentioned already a controlled process for mass climate migration. And we have a system now that is a controlled process. It's poorly controlled. It's in some cases insanely designed, but that we have a national border structure that controls or mediates the movement of people. But you're mentioning a controlled process. Presumably, it's a more rational, a more equitable, and a better process. But it still involves humans making decisions about who goes where and how. The other option would be no control, would be some, hard to imagine, but some future in which we return to the standard pattern of human history, which is people move when and where they can, how they can, with minimal or no restrictions. Talk about the tension between those two, because I think we can both see positive and negative implications of both.
I mean, certainly, if you enable people to move much more freely, certainly as freely as we enable goods and other resources to cross borders, generally people move to where the work is, right? And that's, where there is a need for labor, ergo, that's where these people are most useful and more likely to get jobs and contribute to the economies better. No, I think that we should help guide this a little bit. And in terms of borders, I don't think completely getting rid of them at this stage of our global society's huge complexity. I think that we should monitor them to a certain degree, so that we know roughly where people are, so that they can contribute to taxes, so that we can plan the future in terms of, industry, infrastructure, allocations of school places, healthcare, all of those sorts of things require some sort of data about where people are likely to be in a few years. I think that's important. But at the same time, I think we need to be much, much, much more liberal about allowing people to move. And that's for economic reasons as well as humanitarian reasons. It would solve a lot of the problems we have. Now, there are ways of doing this. There are ways of sort of guiding it. I mean, there is a time of life everywhere across the globe, across cultures, where people naturally move, and that's kind of late teens to early 30s.
Right.
Wherever you are, people are leaving home. They're leaving for education, for jobs, for love, for curiosity, to travel, apprenticeships, training, pilgrim, following a religion or whatever. This is a time when they leave the family unit and set up a new unit. And there are various different ways that this new household formation is described. But this is a time when people move anyway, because the problem with migration is that we are the most socially reliant animal that has ever existed. We're absolutely dependent on our social networks for everything. We can't survive on our own. And that means that if you leave this social network to start somewhere else, it's very, very hard. And that's not counting the prejudice you might face because you don't have the same skin color, you don't speak the right language, you don't have the right accent, you don't follow the right religion, your clothes are wrong, whatever the hell. Not even counting any of that, just not having that network that you can depend on and rely on is very difficult. And so one of the biggest problems we actually face is trying to persuade people who don't want to move for their own safety. Mm-hmm. And that's been a huge problem in the US as well. When you have a hurricane coming in, or you have Sandy or Ida or whatever the hell, is getting people to evacuate to safety, because it requires a lot of trust as well in state, in institutions. And that trust has been eroded gradually over, recent years. So people don't want to move, and so we need to help them move. And I think the best time to target people and help guide that general movement is that crucial time. So we need to identify safe places in the northern hemisphere, in Canada, around the Great Lakes, in Northern Europe, in Siberia, etc., where we are going to expand existing cities or build new cities with academic institutions, with good transport connections, with new industries, and basically seduce those people. So when they move there, that is the time when everybody is moving, and that is the time when they are ready to form new networks. Students that move to university or move for their first job, they are in the mental space and in the social space to create their new networks. They have their family networks and their home networks back there, but they are ready to create their new ones. So it's a much better and easier time to move, to become part of that society, to become the new citizens, and and embed their lives in this new place. And then they are in a better position with their own special network set up to then help bring out elderly relatives or younger relatives or friends or whatever from dangerous locations elsewhere on the road. So I think we need to make this work through those different social interventions, as well as the much more formal ones of new UN passports or bilateral agreements or regional agreements and quota systems to try and make things much easier, and take away this whole dangerous. When you were talking earlier about the war on the southern border, we have this going on, and yet it's absolutely completely well known that there are lots and lots of undocumented migrants performing really, really necessary jobs within our economy, whether it's food production or whatever it is, that we couldn't do without. And so every now and again there's an amnesty which is projected as this great act of generosity. I mean, it's not at all. It's an act of pragmatism. We need these people.
Yeah, it's one of the two stickiest problems here, and it's weird that I'm focusing on these two that we'll talk about, because there's so many other sticky problems, right? And so many of them have to do with simple recognition of climate change in some communities and others.
I'll just say, because there's some really interesting papers in the last few months that have come out that have shown this hugely strong correlation between drought seasons in Central America and immigration to the US. There's an absolute, you can just draw that line. Times of severe drought, there's much more migration. People don't want to leave, but they have no choice. And as the temperature goes up, as these extreme weather conditions happen, people are going to have to move. So, we need to stop trying to pretend that there is a way to sort of solve this other than pragmatically managing what has happened and make it work for America, right?
And that gets to the political science question. And there's also a social psychology question we'll get to. But the big one is the political science question that I've alluded to, which is you've said we should guide and monitor this process. And that gets to the core issues of politics, is who decides. And most of us can agree that the methods we have pertaining to this issue in particular, that our selections of who decides have been suboptimal and have not led to the enlightened policies that we would like to see. So other than yourself being grand global dictator.
Well, I mean, I've got some ideas.
You've got credentials. And you don't have enough free time on your hands. You'd have to put some things aside that you treasure. But, there's always that issue of, how do we select the people who will make the best choices for the greatest number? And that becomes a core issue that people have struggled with for thousands of years, is who decides. The stakes are so high now. And what's frustrating for me looking at this issue is you look at some very contentious issues in the world or in a particular country that's holding an election, if you're lucky enough to have an election. And mitigating climate change is rarely on there. And in terms of the top priorities people are voting based on, and much less so is somebody who is enlightened about the mass movements of hundreds of millions and ultimately billions of people, if not within our lifetimes, within the lifetimes of our children. You will not find people selecting leaders based on that. And yet one of the primary issues you're advocating for is we need enlightened leadership that can guide and monitor a more rational process. And that one troubles me because I don't see an easy path from getting to A, the recognition that what you're saying is true, to B, the leadership that can guide and monitor that process.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, this is the big problem, isn't it?
I hate being pessimistic about it. I'm very optimistic in the long term because I think humans are really good at problem solving collectively over geological time.
I mean, it will happen. People are going to move because we can't stop them,
yes.
and we are going to have to do something about climate change, right? They are intertwined, these problems, of course. The faster we act to mitigate climate change, the fewer people will have to move, the more money and help we give to poor places to adapt, the fewer people will have to move, and all of that sort of thing. But you know, I'm a big believer actually in regional leadership and even breaking it down into cities and city states, because I see a lot more enlightened, faster moving action and more citizen focused action actually from city mayors, I think. And I also think they're best placed to act on a lot of this because they have the immediate knowledge of, you know, who needs housing, where the shortages in labour are, where, you know, which districts need more of whatever, and you know, where the transport links should be, and all of those sorts of issues, as well as, you know, the local adaptations that people rely on every day to do with, you know, heat, managing floodwaters, and, you know, generating clean energy, all of these things. And there has certainly been a lot of city mayors that have acted really fast. I mean, if you look at what California, that's a state, I know, but if you look at what California is doing in comparison to some other states,
which will go unnamed but are obvious.
You see a lot more progress. If you look at what Paris city mayor has done just in the last few years, transformed it. We now see most journeys being by bicycle or walking, because they've dramatically changed the equation between you know, the safety and security of cycling and car on streets. So you just need to get to that tipping point. You know, what puts me off cycling with my kids is the fact that I could get run down by a double-decker bus or whatever, that's London, or whatever, or a truck, or that, you know, somebody will steal my bike and all of those sorts of things. So once there's you know, bikes and pedestrians are prioritized, and green planting and those social spaces, you know, the economy responds. You get these really nice you know, the entrepreneurs that bring out cafes into the streets. You see people selling stuff, but you also see entertainment spaces and the greening of neighborhoods. And it just becomes easier to cycle than to drive. Like, where am I going to park? It's really awkward. I can't go down half these streets. So that is the tipping point that encourages that. And we've seen that across the world. Madrid, you know, there are many places where city mayors have really been at the forefront of this, and quite often they're also the least xenophobic places, because cities are heavily reliant on immigrant workforces, and people are used to living and working and having their neighbours be, you know, a different colour to them or a different religion, and it's not a problem. It's, I think, the small rural communities who never actually encounter immigrants that have the biggest fear and the biggest problem with the immigrants coming in, and the immigrants aren't even going to go to that place because there's no jobs, there's no, right? So that's the paradox, really. Right. So I'm in favour of that, and then you get that competition, you know, survival of the fittest situation, where the greenest, most pleasant, economically vibrant places of opportunity are the places where people want to go. They're the place that you're more likely to have a higher living standard, where it's just more pleasant to be. And so those places thrive, because of their more progressive values and ideas of what good living is about, which is kind of clean air. It's about, an economy that's working, that isn't massively prejudiced and fearful, and, where people can relax as themselves, I think. Yeah.
One counter factor to that, and I think here of the case that you may have mentioned as well, which is that there's a massive wage difference between, let's say, Greece and Germany. And Greece has suffered immensely from some of the effects of climate change in recent years. And yet you're not seeing a mass migration of Greeks to Germany, at least in part, and I think in large part to the fact that people like living in Greece, that people like home. And this is absolutely tragic for many of the island nations and nations like Bangladesh that are low-lying enough that there literally will be no home at a certain point in the future. And so there will be a forced move. But there are many places where people can try to get by and do a lot of other technological and other solutions because they like the feeling of home. You can have a lot of rational points. Everything we've just talked about, why moving to perhaps a city in Germany that is more, quote, livable and has been adapted with green spaces and bicycling and quality of life in many ways. But if somebody says, no, this is my country, that has a very strong appeal that can override a whole lot of both rational arguments and economic incentives.
Yeah, well, this speaks to what I was saying before, that most people don't want to leave. It's actually really hard to leave. It's really hard to leave your network. It's really hard to start off somewhere new. And that's why we have this responsibility to make it easier for people. They shouldn't also have to, play with their lives, risk their lives in trying to cross a border. I mean, that's just, that's just appalling when we have mechanisms to help people move to safety. Because the truth is that most people don't move, you're right. If it was just a completely pragmatic decision, you would expect, like, a lot of Mexico to be empty now. You'd expect, there to be, despite these really terrible conditions, we're only seeing, thousands, in some cases from war zones, like a few million, but very, very few people really moving from pretty intolerable conditions. And that's why, as a global community, we have to help people move to safety. I mean, people are still, government policy needs to help with this, because people are still buying and building homes in very risky zones, from Florida Keys to New Orleans to, fire risk zones in California. I mean, this should be impossible.
Right.
It's already becoming harder because, insurance companies are moving out of many of these places because they won't take the risk.
And that's the fascinating point, isn't it, Gaia? That governments have failed. And you can see that in terms of distributing the cost to a larger society of rebuilding an entire city that is going to experience a catastrophe again or is unlivable in the near future. But it's the insurance companies that are prompting change because governments aren't.
Yeah, and governments are now, underwriting some of the costs because you can't get insurance. But that's not going to continue. And what you're getting is this kind of climate apartheid. You're getting this hierarchy of livability where rich people, can afford to move somewhere else. They can afford, after a disaster, a catastrophe, to rebuild somewhere. Or move, and poor people are stuck with unsellable assets, and so they can't afford to buy anywhere else, uninsurable houses, or a business that's, uninsurable, or there's, most people have left now that area because it's a disaster zone. And so they're just not getting the business that they used to have. Or, in the case of some tragedies where an entire area is destroyed, you get this kind of colonization by wealthy companies where somewhere is determined unlivable, and so the government won't help them rebuild there. But meanwhile, expensive resort owners or other people that don't need to rely on government grants or assistance will then just kind of smother that land and take over those really important traditional areas from local places. And we need a lot more oversight on all of this, because it's only going to be an increasing problem. And at the moment, it's really not being managed, and there's a lot going on that isn't being reported properly and people are not aware of. And so when there is a disaster, or when people are told, you can't live here, or you must evacuate because a storm's coming, there isn't that trust. Right? There isn't the trust. They don't believe, or they're too nervous of leaving it because they think they're going to be exploited in one way or another. There isn't the transparency. There aren't these honest conversations. There isn't the pragmatism. And, you can't solve these problems without talking about them. And I think the best shot we have as a society is to make democratic decisions together about, how we plan and use the shared places that are livable on the planet.
Yeah, overcoming some really big obstacles. It's not easy, but we're not doing this because it's easy, right? That the whole point is that it's an epic challenge. So there is that political question that we talked about in terms of who decides and how do we get such leadership. The other thing that has me pessimistic in the short term is the social psychology of it all. You pointed out that, yes, in some communities, you do have a more cosmopolitan point of view. You have more acceptance of people who don't look like us. But in times of crisis, that sometimes doesn't go well. And we are entering times of crisis in many ways during this transition period. We can have all the rational reasons in the world not to fear immigrants. And I hope that we do a better job of educating people about the basic facts that are often used as crutches. But social psychology suggests that there always is an in-group, out-group dynamic in human psychology. And it plays out, unfortunately, in negative ways. One of those ways is simply, in some communities, seeing migrants who don't look like me, they become the outgroup. And it's easy to find excuses not to incorporate them. Again, long-term, I'm optimistic because we overcome these things. And in fact, we've thrived as a species because we've overcome some of these social psychological barriers. But in the short term, you can have the best arguments in the world to tell somebody in a certain community, this will benefit your community, this will enrich your culture, this will enrich your life, and it's going to happen anyway, so you might as well assist it happening in the right way. And you will have people who are otherwise rational just say, yeah, but I don't like them. And I really struggle with how to overcome that when argumentation alone doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And that's what populists play into, of course. Mm-hmm. They reduce the complexity down to these simplistic things, and that's very seductive. And people like that. They like somebody to blame. There isn't always somebody to blame. And if there is, it's quite often the populist leader that's failing them. It's certainly not, the most vulnerable members of our society, which is a very good reason among many for rejecting populism. Mm-hmm. When we do surveys of people, of populations, generally we find most people, the majority of people, are actually kind, generous, non-xenophobic, not racist. Mm-hmm. They're not that prejudiced, actually. And they're open and welcoming to strangers and to new people. And this is something, that instead of sort of nurturing the opposite through populism, we need to nurture this feeling and this idea. And that comes with education, right from childhood onwards, and education that continues. I would say that, you can think that all these problems are intractable and there's no way that nations would agree all of this. And I just ask you to cast your mind back to the end of World War II, when there was real animosity, like absolute hatred between nations. Countries were completely broken. Their cities were like rubble, destroyed. The economies of most nations were in tatters. It saw the end of, all the sort of social hierarchies and social makeup, everything from, the different class systems to empires to colonies. Entire new nations were formed. All of that. There was a terribly enormous amount of migration. There were famines. There were diseases. There was all sorts going on. And yet, out of this absolute mess, countries and nations, leaders that really hated each other and had reason to, they'd had personal losses at the hands of these decision makers, came together and formed a united nations to try and make a better world. They formed a World Health Organization in order to try and eradicate diseases like smallpox and polio. They came together and had the idea for a declaration of human rights. I mean, all these like really, really enormous, unbelievably profound institutions and ideas came out of countries that really hated each other. And right now, we're not in that situation at all. Most of the world is actually at peace, relatively. We have some wars, terrible wars, but we are mostly at peace. And we have these unions and agreements and relationships between many nations. It should be so much easier to solve these problems. It really should.
I love that idea. You've actually given me the bridge from pessimism to optimism there, which is we've had the manifestation of those dynamics in horrific violence leading to tens of millions of deaths. And yet, just within a few decades, for example, the US-Japan relationship went from one of absolute horror to one of prosperity for both mutually, upon principles of a better world, upon principles more pacifistic in the Japanese sense than the American, certainly, but certainly overcoming those issues in a positive way. We can do it. We've proven we can do it. We can educate our children how that is done at a personal and at a collective level, and that can help us get there. So thank
Absolutely.
you. You've made me feel better in just the last few minutes. We close our conversations here by reaching into our chatter box and pulling out a random question. So Gaia, for you, what misperception about your profession or specialty makes your blood boil? What are the things you don't like hearing people responding to your work or people get wrong about what you do and why you do it?
I guess there are two extremes. Some people think that I'm an activist, and I am in a way that I hope that my writing changes minds, but I hope that that's the point of all writing, right? And just generally my work does that. But I don't class myself as some of the brave people who are really putting themselves on the front line, like, Greta Thunberg and some of the other activists who are really risking their lives to bring people's notice to it. So there's that. And then some people mistakenly think that being a writer or I also present television and radio programs is somehow glamorous. Really, the reality is very unglamorous. And it's a lot of sitting on my own in front of a computer.
Glamour is not something that I've associated with this kind of public public speaking and research. Maybe they assume you're being, flown around in fancy jets and being escorted to speaking, but there's actual hard work that goes into public communication about some of these issues, and I hope people do appreciate that. It certainly is reflected in your work. It doesn't seem like anything you do is easy, because you're tackling the tough questions and you're trying to figure out answers.
Yeah, and it is hard. I mean, it is hard to sort of wrestle with your thoughts and try and articulate them in a way that makes sense, even to yourself, let alone to other people. It is enjoyable as well. I have to remind myself of that when it's not enjoyable.
Well, I hope it's enjoyable, not only intrinsically, but also just to know that people from a wide variety of backgrounds, at least one political scientist, absolutely enjoy your work and have benefited immensely from it. So thank you for the work you've done. And of course, thank you for joining me today for this conversation.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure, David. Thank you so much.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.